That's all from us. Now it's time for the news where you are. The news where you are comes after the news where we are. The news where we are is the news. It comes first. The news where you are is the news where you are. It comes after. We do not have the news where you are. The news where you are may be news to you, but it is not news to us. The news may be international, national, or regional. The news where we are may be international news. The news where you are is never international news. Where you are is not international. The news where you are comes after the international and national news. The news where you are may be national news or regional news. However, national news where you are is not national news where we are. It is the news where you are. If the news where you are is national news, it is only national where you are. The news where we are is national wherever you are. On Saturdays, there is no news where you are. In fact, there is no news where you are on Saturdays. Any news there is not where you are. It is where we are. If there is news where you are but not where we are, it will wait until Sunday. After the news where you are comes the weather. The weather where you are is not national. The weather where you are comes after the news where you are, and after the weather where you are comes the national weather. Do not confuse the national weather with the weather where you are. The weather where you are comes first, but is lesser weather than the national weather. Extreme weather is news. However, weather that is more extreme where you are than where we are is not news. Weather that is extreme where we are is news, even if extreme weather where we are is only average weather where you are. On average, weather where you are is more extreme than weather where we are. Tough shit. Good.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence podcast number 111, and yes, I will literally use any excuse to republish The News Where You Are by James Robertson. It's fantastic. However, there is actually a reason for putting that one on the show this time, because this time I spoke with Professor John Robertson, who's put out a book about the media coverage in the run-up to the independence referendum, and I'm sure it won't come as a massive shock to a lot of you to find it wasn't quite as fair as it might have been. You can actually download the book free on my website page for this podcast. So we talked about that, the larger media environment, and some of the suggestions that have been going on since the referendum about what's to be done about it. John doesn't hold back as usual, and it's well worth the listen. So we'll just go straight to the conversation, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Hi John, how's it going?
Well, thank you, Michael.
You've got a book that's coming out. Well, you've put it out online now, but it was going to come out, and then it wasn't going to be come out with a specific publisher. But I believe you've had problems with that. Maybe we should start there. What were the problems with the publisher?
I'll make the story as short as possible because it could be quite long. About a year ago, Welsh Academic Press contacted me and suggested I write a book based on the research I've been doing, and then fleshing it out with a review of other people's research and my thoughts about why this had happened. And so I did that. And I got on with it really quite quickly and submitted a full draft, in December 2014. And from December 2014 until now, it still hasn't been published by them. There's been a long sequence of the emails between the editor and myself, which mostly I've seen as evidence of a kind of either he was too busy or he was incompetent, but certainly not a kind of conspiracy idea developing in my mind until quite recently. And I've started to look back at the trail of emails, And I'm starting to think it just doesn't make any sense that it's taken so long. And it's still, I mean, the contract was actually ran out a few days ago. The contract kind of, you would think if you have a contract for a book coming out, then the website would advertise the book as forthcoming. And the book's still not advertised as forthcoming. And so I decided a few days ago that I was just tired of the excuses, and thought I'll just self-publish it free. And I'm feeling quite good about that, actually. I think I'm thinking about myself, well, that's quite cool, actually, to have done that, to publish it free. I think far better to do that. But I'm angry also because I think it's kind of missed the moment. I think if we'd published it last January or whatever, I think it might have got a lot more attention. I've just put it on my own blog, and I've tweeted it around in places. But and about 40 or 50 people have downloaded it so far, which is not a huge number. Part of my brain, I'm not a paranoid person by nature. I tend to be naive, and my wife tells me people pull the wool over my eyes on a regular basis. But one or two of my Facebook friends and Twitter friends have expressed their suspicion about the whole process, and have wondered if Welsh Academic Press were got at. As I say that, I'm twitching with anxiety about saying such a thing. But that's the kind of picture, really. So I thought I'd just publish it myself.
And since you self-published it, have you had any contact with them? Have they got back to you?
No, I sent them an email. I've sent them several emails over the summer, which they haven't replied to at all. That was after long periods of not replying, and then only replying when I sent them really kind of big, bold titles in my emails, like, I had a stroke, remember? That kind of thing. So they haven't replied, and the second and third last two warned them that I would self-publish if they didn't show me that they had it ready to go by the end of the contract, which is 1st September, which is today. And they haven't replied at all. I'm not going to phone them because I just don't. I found it quite stressful, and as I've mentioned already, I had a mini stroke a few years ago, and I found the whole publishing thing quite stressful. The being ignored, the massive delays, the kind of advice I thought was really kind of wrong. I think he misunderstood the purpose of the book. So it was an unpleasant experience, and I thought, well, I'm retiring this year. I don't have to take any of that, so I'll just put it out, and it'll be what I think, unadulterated what I think. And if I'm crazy, I'm crazy.
Okay, so I'll put it on my website on the blog post for this as well, so to get it out to some more people. So we should move to the content of the book. So if you can give us an overview of what it's about, and then we'll get into some of the specifics. Okay.
Well, it begins with an account of the actual experience I had in publishing the research and the I suppose bullying by the BBC, the visit to Parliament, and so on. There's a short chapter on that, and then it's pretty heavily the empirical research. It's my own studies into Reporting Scotland and Good Morning Scotland, and one or two other short pieces I wrote in the days before the referendum, which I think fairly convincingly demonstrate a problem of bias. They don't explain why, but I go on to talk about that. So the first 2 or 3 chapters are about the coverage of the referendum in broadcasting, including radio, in newspapers, and in social media. And then I go on to use material I already had, of course, to explain what I think is happening here, the nature of propaganda, and its semi-conscious nature a lot of the time. And as you know already, I'm inspired pretty much by Noam Chomsky's propaganda model. I know it sits at the end of a continuum in terms of media critique. It's by far the most damning critique of the media industries, and it takes the view that the media industries, with the exception obviously of organisations like yourself, are very much part of corporate media, and they respond to corporate expectations. So there's a chapter about that which tries to explain how that happens. The fact that it's not always conscious is explained, and then I go on to talk about maybe I think what interests me most is that maybe what has happened in Scotland, and I think might be happening now in England with Corbyn, and I think what has happened in Spain and Greece, and maybe some other places too, is that I think corporate propaganda has become dramatically less effective than it used to be. And I think Chomsky's propaganda model might need to have added to an anti-propaganda model that now, I think this is very evident in the Corbyn campaign, is that attacking Corbyn is strengthening him. That not only are the media unable to damage him, if they try to damage him, they make it better. It's almost like everything bounces now. It's as if the general population have gone over a cusp of some kind, where they now don't just not trust the media, they assume the media are telling the opposite of the truth. I don't think that applies to everybody, but I think that there's a trend towards that.
I think that generally happened with politicians a long time ago, and maybe now it's moved on to another facet with the media.
Yes, probably, yeah. And I think there are exceptions. I think, obviously, a lot of the smaller social media agencies, the indie media, you might call them in Scotland, I think are trusted quite a bit. Though that may change as well.
But in the book, one of the things that was focused on quite a lot was Good Morning Scotland and their coverage of the referendum. Could you give us a run through of what was wrong with Good Morning Scotland's coverage?
Good Morning Scotland were so wrong in a sense that I weakened, and Newsnet Scotland did a crowdsourcing thing to raise money to pay the university for me to do a month-long study of Good Morning Scotland in April 2014. And I did that. It was quite a demanding thing, just because the radio programmes are quite long to do the decoding of. And I found a level of bias in Good Morning Scotland that far transcended that of Reporting Scotland. Reporting Scotland's not as long, of course, so they're not able to. And I think they have a slightly stronger sense that they might be attacked if they're too nakedly biased. The Good Morning Scotland seemed almost shameless, and I stopped listening to them after that. I couldn't bear it. Luckily, a guy called George Kerr from Greenock, who's a Facebook friend, continued. He's a stronger man. He's ex-army. He's a stronger man than I am. He continued to monitor Good Morning Scotland and send me little tidbits. But the bias was blatant, I think, there. For example, the questioning techniques. That was the most remarkable. The way that yes supporters, including politicians and industrialists and so on, were questioned, and the way that no supporters were questioned was quite markedly different. We had, for example, the much talked about James Naughtie. I do wonder why. James Naughtie haranguing Nicola Sturgeon, bullying Nicola Sturgeon, interrupting more times than with other people, trying to cut her off quickly, and using deprecating tones in his voice. And then he himself going to Washington and interviewing George Robertson, and phoning, not asking George a difficult question, despite the fact that George Robertson was clearly tripping, I thought, on I suppose completely paranoid ideas about what would happen if Scotland pulled out of NATO. And yet Naughtie gave him an easy time. And they did this several times. Not just Naughtie, but other, Hayley Miller in particular, with a very kind of sarcastic and patronising tone with yes supporting industrialists and so on. And then actually feeding no supporters with evidence they could use. I thought it was quite disgraceful.
Well, obviously when they're feeding no supporters with helpful questions and so on, that's another level. But another thing that was very noticeable was the choices of research groups and think tanks that they used that were then presented as non-biased and completely impartial. And I believe there's a part in the book about that as well.
Yes, that's throughout, I suppose, the book. Because, the big choice that journalists make, I think the most important choice they make is the choice of sources. And we know that journalism, allegedly, everybody's so busy, they take sources quickly. They're kind of cognitive misers. In the report on Good Morning Scotland, I had focused on that, and I agree with you that it's perhaps the most significant element in the whole business of propaganda is the use of what are partial organisations, partisan organisations, and their presentation as somehow truth. And that was particularly true, I think, in some of the coverage Good Morning Scotland did, but it was also true in Reporting Scotland in the newspapers. And the most obvious example would be the Office of Budget Responsibility, whose output was always negative about independence,